Hello and welcome, Carios here, and today I bring you another Death Knight tanking guide. Basically, I decided to make a video where I talk a little bit about your spec, some abilities, and ultimately take you on a full, hands-on Death Knight tanking experience. Well, hope you enjoy. Okay, let's get started with your talents. Now, I did say I was going to be very in-depth, but I'm going to try not to elaborate too much on the talents, since I am limited to how much I can post on YouTube, since I'm not an old director, I'm a new director, so I don't have that ability to post more than 15 minutes. And you'd be surprised how long this is going to take. So basically, I'm going to elaborate as much as I can on the talents, but if you are confused or you have any more concerns, feel free to leave a comment or you can email me, and I'll be glad to elaborate more on the talent, because these talents, there's so many things, you can elaborate on them. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I have a big dragon in front of me. Hello there. Okay, let's go ahead and continue. Basically, Butchery, this is more of a DPS leveling kind of talent. You don't really need this for tanking. Next up would be Blade Barrier. Blade Barrier basically reduces damage taken by 6%. For the next 10 seconds. In order for you to activate Blade Barrier, all you have to do is have your blood runes on cooldown. So that's very easy to keep. Bladed Armor. This I only have 2 out of 3, simply because I feel Vengeance gives you much more attack power, and Threat is really never an issue, or at least for me it isn't, but if you are, then feel free to put more points in there. Next one is Improved Blood Tap. Now Blood Tap basically converts a random rune into a death rune. A death rune is basically either a blood rune, an unholy rune, or a frost rune. Again, if that doesn't really make any sense, you can feel free to comment. But basically, it's going to convert any random rune, such as, let's say for instance I activated and it converted my unholy into a death rune. So that means that death rune can count as any of them, of any of the other runes. So if I'm using one blood rune and I just finished using the other blood rune and there's a death rune, and the next attack that I use is, let's say for instance, a heart strike, then it's going to count that death rune into blood. So you see where I'm going with this? So it counts it for all of them. That's basically what Blood Tap does. Scent the Blood. This is, I would say, mandatory. Well, for me, in my style of gameplay, simply because having the ability to generate more runic power is very important, especially when you're using Rune Strike all the time. Since they did fix Rune Strike and it doesn't rely on dodge or parry anymore. As long as you have 30 runic power, you can use it. So it's awesome to know that the more runic power I'm getting, the more rune strikes. So I definitely want to put points in that. Scarlet Fever. As I mentioned before in the other guide, what Scarlet Fever does. So this is where you get that ability from. You definitely want to put all 2 in there. Next up is going to be Hand of Doom. Now Hand of Doom, you don't need this, honestly, unless you find yourself having to interrupt, which you really shouldn't be doing anything more than Mind Freeze. Then you can go ahead and put that, but other than that, it's more of a PvP DPS kind of talent. Bloodcake Blade. This is optional if you honestly need more thread, and keep in mind this only affects your white damage, then you can go ahead and put the points in there. Other than that, you really don't. Bone Shield. This used to be in the Unholy Tree, but they put it into the Blood Tree, which is really awesome, so you get that extra cooldown, as I mentioned before in the other guide. So moving on. Toughness. Toughness is mandatory. You need this. Increases your armor value from your items by 10%. Abomination's Might. As you can see, it's grayed out. You're probably wondering why. I'll go ahead and explain. Simply because I found it to be optional. I believe Enhancement Chamois, I could be wrong, I'm very horrible with other classes, provides the 10% attack power, or could with their totem, and a Hunter can. So unless you're absolutely sure that your party or raid will not provide it, then always have an extra spec. If you're not a DPS, then which has this point, so you can provide the extra 10% attack power. It also gives you the strength, but which would result into parry. It's very optional. Sanguine Fortitude, basically it does two things. One, it makes your Icebound Fortitude, which is your strongest cooldown, in instant. It allows it not to cost any runic power, which is really nice because it did cost a ridiculous amount before. So whenever you would hit that holy crap moment and you didn't have enough runic on you, then you wouldn't be able to use it, so that kind of sucked. So now with this it makes it instant, and also it increases the damage reduction on it. So I believe you can get a total of 50% damage reduction on your Icebound Fortitude. Blood Parasite. This was revamped. They increased it. It used to suck in Wrath, but now it's really awesome. So I don't really need to spend too much time on this. I guess I'll leave you with this. From what I've heard from DPS and from healers, is that it can heal anywhere between 20 to 25k. So that's a lot, and that's per a worm, not just one. It's per worm, and I can spawn it to 3 worms. So imagine that. That's a lot of healing right there. So you're not only helping your raid, you're also helping your healers. So that's definitely points where you want to put it. Improved blood presence. You definitely want to have this. It increases your rune regeneration by 20%. So we can go ahead and keep those runes going. And also reduces the chance you'll be critically hit by 6%. So this is kind of the compensation for no more defense rating. If you did, if you were in Wrath, then you know before we used to have the whole defense thing we had to worry about, but now we don't. So every tank has something similar to this. Next up would be your Will of Necropolis. This basically is another very strong cooldown, which is passive. Whenever you go below 30% health, you have your rune tap refreshed, which I'll actually explain what the rune tap is. Rune tap converts one blood rune into 10% of your maximum health. Only has a 30-second cooldown. This is another awesome cooldown. So basically you get to heal yourself, and whenever you drop below 30%, it refreshes it so you can heal yourself again. And also your damage taken is reduced by 25% for 8 seconds. So that's really, really nice passive cooldown. Vampiric Blood. This has a 1-minute cooldown. This is an amazing ability. Basically, the tooltip changed, so you might be wondering why doesn't it show the health gain that you get. You still do, but it's not anywhere near as effective as the amount of healing it gives you. It increases your healing effects by 40%. Keep in mind, it's not just your heals, it's also healers healing you. If you have a glyph, which I'll get to in a second, then that's an extra 55%. So actually not 55% in total. So it's 15% from the glyph, so it's 55% in total healing that you're going to be getting, bonus healing from your heals. Next up would be improved Death Strike. This is amazing because it does many things, but the most notable is it increases your amount healed. It increases your damage by 90% from your Death Strike. If you have a 2-piece tier, then that's an additional 5%, giving it a total of 95% damage. It affects the crit of both your heals and your damage. After that goes Crimson Scourge. Crimson Scourge is debatable. You don't really need it unless you're facing heavy AoE situations, such as Nefarian and you're the off tank. Then you definitely want to have this because it gives you free blood boils, so you can use. There's also another thing about this. I really won't elaborate too much on it. So again, if you want to know how this affects your blood runes and your blade barrier, there's a tiny flaw in this. You can go ahead and leave me a comment, or again email me or ask, or just Google it. It's a tiny flaw. It's not really that major, but it is something that's debatable, and Blizz might end up changing a little bit later. But other than that, it's good for AoE situations. And finally, your Dancing Rune Weapon. This is probably your most strongest cooldown aside from your Icebound Fortitude. It does a couple of things. Basically, it applies the diseases. Basically, it copies what you're doing. So it applies the diseases if you have on the same target, and it also deals the same amount of attacks, but for 50% reduced damage. Now that sounds like a lot, but it really isn't. It's still doing everything you're doing, so it's an awesome threat generator, and at the same time it's also going to give you 20% additional parry. So that's really nice, because that parry that it gives you does not count towards diminishing returns. Now if you're wondering what diminishing returns is, if you're new to it, you can check out the Elite Jerks forums or just Google it, and you can get much more detailed explanation how DR works. So basically that's what the DRW does. Moving on, when we get to the Frost, a lot of these things are optional. This is actually called the Lichborn spec. So whichever one works for you, you can go ahead and put points into. I guess I'll go and explain what I have here, simply because this is part of the spec. It's called the Lichborn spec. So I have 3 points into my runic power. So this way I can have a total of 30. So it gives me 130 runic power, which is nice because it's going to be more heals and more rune strikes. Then Icy Reach, this is just a filler. And then finally Lichborn. For those curious of what Lichborn is, it basically makes you become undead, immune to charm for your sleep effects, but when you're healing yourself via Death Coil, that's what you would pop first, and then you can heal yourself. There's actually a macro for it, which I'll show you a little bit later. Next up would be Endless Winter. I put points into this because I felt that having to not worry about whether you are missing runic power in order for you to interrupt, or having to spend runic power on your interrupt. So this is nice. Lastly, on the Unholy goes your Epidemic, which increases the time on your diseases. You should have at minimum 2 points in this, simply because they actually changed the way Virulence works. Now it increases the damage rather than making you spell hit cap, so you don't really need that anymore. But Epidemic is really awesome. It increases the time on those diseases, so you don't have to always keep reapplying them. So that is it for your spec. So now let's go ahead and talk about your glyphs.